Welcome to the program today. My name is Mondo Gonzales, and I am here with a prophecy update this week. And it is always a pleasure to have in studio Bill Salus. Welcome, Bill.
Mondo, it's great, and it's great to be on this new set you got here. First time I've been on it.
Yeah, there's a lot been going on here, and Bill's actually in town to do some programs on some of his other materials. But since he's here, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to really to get into his brain about some of the prophecy things that are going on. And we really want to talk about that because there's a lot of news, especially Middle Eastern news. I mean, you look at Ukraine, you look at Russia, some of the buildup that's going on there. You see the Biden administration trying to play this middle game with the Vienna talks with Iran and the nuclear agreement there. We see Israel putting out threats because of the nuclear talks as it relates to not allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And a lot of things are changing really day by day. There's been several things. Turkey, Russia, Iran. We have the Ezekiel 38 connection. We have so many other connections. I mean, Turkey right now is in a free fall economically with really the value of their currency, the lira. So there's a whole bunch of things that are coming in, and we talked about this just a couple weeks ago. But things are changing so fast. Let's talk a little bit more. What do you see as it relates to the current hot spots? I mean, kind of the different characters melding together. What's your thoughts?
Well, let's talk a little bit about globally and then kind of zoom on the focus lens into the Middle East. It's interesting, Russia's been in the news. They've got roughly about 125,000 troops near the borders of Ukraine. They've had a frozen war with Ukraine for about 7 years, but all of a sudden now, perhaps coincidentally or no coincidence, that the Biden's the president, they're moving aggressively in that direction, as is China with Taiwan. Is China about to move in on Taiwan? Geopolitically, Russia has a goal, as I understand it, to take over Ukraine because they provide an enormous amount of natural gas through Europe. And they can I think you told me Ukraine had denied Russia the ability to run that pipeline through Ukraine to get into Europe and things like that. So that if they could take over Ukraine, they would have the ability to run their natural gas directly through instead of through Turkey, which a lot of it goes through Turkey right now. They could actually go through Ukraine and divert it that way. So there's geopolitical reasons Russia's interested in the Ukraine. They took over Crimea, I believe it was in 2014, which is much smaller and not as formidable as Ukraine, without firing a weapon, a bullet. So basically at this point we got to watch that area there. Turkey struggling economically. Well, remember that in Ezekiel 38 they're coming after Israel for plunder and booty, great plunder and booty. That means that those economies that Russia puts together with its coalition, including Turkey and Iran, and there's 9 members altogether in that coalition, their economies are probably in need of plunder and booty. There's something going on in their economy. So when we see the economies of those countries faltering, it gives us another indication that Ezekiel 38 prophecy is probably coming pretty closely. It's drawing near. The relationships we see with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, even though they're strange bedfellows, you got Shiite Iran, you got Sunni Turkey, you got communist Russia. They're strange bedfellows, but we see their alliances are, especially since the Syrian revolution, have become closer and closer. So a lot of us believe Ezekiel 38 is coming real soon. But you and I had a discussion before we went on set about how soon could Ezekiel 38 happen, which I would like to talk about that after we get through some of this other geopolitical things that are going on. But I think we need to be, I don't think it's a coincidence that with the Biden administration in place, we're seeing advances of a major scale with Russia towards Ukraine, China toward Taiwan. And I think that, I don't think those things would happen if Trump was the president. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong. I'm not trying to get political here, but we need to be realistic about what's going on the ground and the world here today.
It goes back to the conversation we had several months ago, right after I wouldn't even call it a withdrawal, the abandonment that happened in Afghanistan, and not only the abandonment of people, American citizens, but of the $85 billion of technology. And, at that time, we wondered, and we wondered out loud, people can go back and see the video, would America, from that point forward, especially within the current administration, be considered weak? And would that be a sense of a hooks in a jaw of drawing out these really predatory countries, in other words, coming out and being willing to take maybe a minor risk versus, as you said, versus the previous administration. Now they're becoming emboldened a little bit.
Yeah, I think what we have right now is a condition where our enemies don't fear us and our friends don't necessarily revere us or, let's say, trust us. And that's a dangerous situation. You're even seeing right now Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and of course UAE is in the Abraham Accords, United Arab Emirates, actually meeting with Tehran, to try to, because they're concerned about is Iran getting a nuclear weapon and taking over the Middle East, as they've already been doing with their proxies in Hezbollah up in Lebanon, Syria with Bashar al-Assad, Shiite militias in Iraq, the Hamas in the Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE and those GCC by the Persian Gulf countries of the Arab side, they're concerned because when Donald Trump was in president and the Abraham Accords and that sort of thing, they felt that Israel and the U.S. were going to have their backs and perhaps do what they could, even if it was militarily, to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now they're losing faith and hope in that process, so they're actually reaching out on their own to see what they can do to stave off, solve their own national issues with Iran.
Again, the news comes in at really kind of light speed here, and the UN watchdog, we were just discussing this, that the UN watchdog has come out to say very clearly, Iran is not allowing them to go in and observe these sites, which is a breach of the agreement. Everybody knows it. But they've also recognized that, that agreement goes back to 2015, and here we are 6 years later, and they're recognizing that that previous agreement is pretty much worthless. So there's no going back, just re-engaging in that previous agreement. They have to come up with something new because the climate has changed, the circumstances have changed.
That's right. Iran has moved forward and breached a lot of the different aspects of that JCPOA deal that was ratified in 2015. When Trump took the U.S. out of the JCPOA, Iran seized the opportunity to enrich uranium up to 60+% now, 20% at the Fordo, I believe it is, nuclear facility, where they're not supposed to be enriching there at all. They've got 12 times the amount of limit of enriched uranium they're supposed to have. They're not going to roll that back to the 2015. The talks were about, and they had 7 rounds, and the 7th one's pretty much fizzling out at this point in time in Vienna. It was mainly about Iran trying to push for U.S. sanctions to be removed with the hope from the JCPO, the P5+1, that Iran would freeze roll back what it's to the 2015 agreement, which means, what about all that enriched uranium? What about the Fordo and uranium, et cetera? But Iran was saying, well, maybe we'll freeze some of it. And they never even had anything constructive done on that. Then they broke off, and that was after the 6 sessions. The 7th session they recently had, nothing came of that. I don't believe that anything's going to come of that, because even the Biden administration is concerned. Secretary of State Blinken said that he doesn't think they're serious. At this point, they're not really coming to the table with anything to offer. So I think they're just playing chess with the international community.
And if you look at the history, it's like playing chess with somebody who is deliberately doing these things, and the person that's losing is just playing a foolish game. They aren't smart. They're making their moves, and nobody's calling them out. When the general comes out on the Sunday before the talks are supposed to start, and he makes threats against the existence of Israel automatically. Obviously they're not trying to soften anything or to gain goodwill. They're brazen.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm not seeing that. I'm thinking diplomacy is going to fail in that area, and it looks like Israel's gearing up for it to fail. They don't have much reliance on the JCPOA at this point. They see that Iran is breaching these thresholds of nuclear enrichment. Iran recently, this was in a headline that came out, was that they were going to launch a space satellite into space. So they've tried this before and have failed on a few occasions. But this particular one, if it's successful, because there's concerns they've found different ways to get it up there now successful, is that if they could do that, they could then launch an ICBM with a warhead, perhaps nuclear warhead. They could go out to 2,000 kilometers, which is 1,200 some odd miles, could easily hit Israel. And so this is a technology that Israel's watching very closely, that Iran, they're watching it if this is going to be a successful launch of this satellite.
Let's bring it back again as kind of a summary here. We've seen the Pentagon just recently, they denied Israel had asked for a couple planes, that they were supposed to get in 4 years. They asked him, "Can you bring it up bring it up in its delivery?" The United States just a couple days ago said no. So you can see that Israel's trying to prepare themselves, as we discussed before. When people discuss and say, hey, you guys are making a mountain out of a molehill, what's our response? How do you respond to that?
Well, these more than rumors of war is the other way to look
are we
at that.
just taking these, are we sensationalizing the headlines and trying to make something out of it, or are we just doing our job and being watchers?
Well, we're doing that. We're being watchers. This news that has prophetic relevance, especially when it comes in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Iran versus Israel, which are subjects of biblical prophecies that hopefully we'll have a moment to talk about. It's coming at us on a very frequent basis with a very pointed effect of it looks like there's going to be a war. The planes you're talking about was Israel wanted to get these particular planes that could refuel in the air, so Israel could attack Iran. Even the headlines were talking about Israel wants to get an advance on these refueling planes so they can attack Iran. Mm-hmm. We talked about this on a prior update. Israel passed within a budget of $1.5 billion specifically to attack Iran. So, maybe this won't happen in the near future. Maybe it will happen down the road according to the prophecies. But I had to think to myself, Mondo, that Iran has gone too far. They've crossed the threshold of getting so close to a nuclear weapon. Their breakout could be within weeks in some estimates. Israel has vowed they will not allow this to happen. It's an existential threat. And it's not just Iran alone. It's Iran and its proxies all around Israel. They recently just built a big old wall. They've got a wall to the north, a couple walls to the north, preventing Hezbollah from invading a ground war. They just built another big wall by the Gaza, right? So they're really paying attention to not only Iran, but all the proxies around them, because Iran has them surrounded.
When we think about prophecy, there's no doubt Jesus in the Olivet Discourse and other certainly passages, we understand some general trends of prophecy. You've written about all of them, going back in your 5-book series. Pre-tribulation prophecy, I want to talk a little bit about that. But as we look forward, we say, okay, well, the reason that we're watching is because we know that there's some big things coming on the horizon. Certainly we've talked about Jeremiah 49, we've talked about the Elam prophecies, and Ezekiel 38, Psalm 83. There's several of these things that are out there. We know that there are no signs specifically for the rapture, okay? But there's these other prophecies that come into play that we're watching because why? If Ezekiel 38 was to happen tomorrow, or let's say 6 months from now, whatever, it's showing us that things are heating up in such a way that just means the rapture is that much ever closer, because there is periods of time when things are they ebb and flow in the prophetic fulfillment, right?
That's right. And the other thing too is that, we're actually going to do a show on the pre-tribulation prophecies, which is a prophetic documentary that Pastor Tom Hughes and I did, 2-disc DVD. But the thing is, there's about 20 pre-tribulation prophecies that are pretty clearly going to happen before the tribulation. And of course, one of the real big ones in that, the good news for all the believers watching, is the rapture. Obviously, that's a pre-tribulation prophecy. But we don't know if that's going to happen before all the other 20 or so, or somewhere in the middle. Is God going to keep the church here to explain to the world, hey, the Damascus just got destroyed overnight. Read Isaiah 17:1. Bring glory to God through fulfillment of prophecies. Predictions that he issued through the prophets thousands of years ago, right? Centuries ago. We don't know, but one of those things that I believe is a pre-tribulation prophecy is Ezekiel 38. Will the church be here for that? Will we be taken out and then it happens shortly thereafter? So, these are interesting things, but we're seeing, like you said, if Ezekiel 38 is stage setting to come pretty soon, and I don't think it can happen immediately. I'd put it out there a little ways, but I see it's coming quick. What are the things that need to precede it? And perhaps the rapture is one of those things that could precede it. It doesn't need to precede it. But there are other things that have to happen for Israel to find itself in the condition described in Ezekiel 38, verses 8 through 13, where we find them as a safe-dwelling people brought back into the nations, brought out from the nations into Israel in the latter days, dwelling securely, without walls, bars, nor gates, and a land of unwalled villages, in receipt of great plunder and booty. And of course, Russia puts together this formidable coalition with Turkey and Iran and other members to come and invade that Israel. And because I don't see that Israel existing just yet, without walls, bars, nor gates, dwelling that securely with that much plunder and booty, I think that certain things have to happen to precede, to set the stage for that. So I'm looking at Ezekiel 38 coming up in the horizon, not necessarily, maybe not even in 2022. I see other things happening in 2022 that are prophetic, perhaps. Maybe 2023. It's going to take a few things to happen, in my estimation, for Israel to be in the condition that we find them in Ezekiel 38.
That's important because as we think about the timing, a lot of us, we get questions all the time. I'm sure you do, Bill. Is when? Well, wouldn't we all like to know? Really. But the when is important because it helps us to see things. But a wise prophetic watcher doesn't give dates, because it's a humbling act if you want to watch people who have done it. But in the meantime, certainly the Lord could come back today as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, regardless of your prophetic perspective. We're called to be ready and watching at all times. We also know that by watching prophecy, it helps to keep us holy, right? We're to grow in holiness and purity because as we see these things, we want to be ready if the Lord comes and we stand before Him on that day. And we want it to go well. It's one of our goals here. And so, we have a good time. You and I have a great time talking in the sense that we're over here, well, what about this? And what about this? And what could be the scenario? And we say it with, genuine humility. We love to conjecture. It's not wrong to conjecture. No one here is going to say, thus says the Lord. But let's talk about that for a moment because when we think about the scenario, I had asked you earlier, and you kind of mentioned it, when would you think Ezekiel 38 could happen? And you had said, maybe a year or 2 years out because of some other things that need to happen prior. What are those things?
Right. Well, like I said, Israel has to be dwelling in certain geopolitical and economic conditions at the time that Russia and its coalition invades. I don't think that Israel's in those conditions just yet. They are not dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates. They've got walls all around. They've got the 403 plus mile wall, partition wall, that keeps Palestinian terror out of Israel proper. They got the walls to the north with Lebanon, the border with Gaza. And of course, those walls are to prevent ground attacks and invasion. That's what walls are always built for in them historically, no different than now. And that's why Hezbollah and Hamas were building tunnels underneath those walls, so they could circumvent the protection of those walls. I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be a sequence of biblical prophecies that are going to happen probably very soon. And again, this, like we said, we're conjecture. We're mainly trying to just give you ideas of what we think could happen. That may not happen for a while. The Lord is very merciful and long-suffering. But when the prophecies happen, He's going to execute His vengeance and His fury through these prophecies. That's one of the things that happen with a lot of the prophecies we're about to talk about. One of them is that there's going to be a disaster in Iran in Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39. Because the Lord is fiercely angry with the leadership of Iran because they want to launch something lethal somewhere. These are the details within the prophecy. And that something they want to launch lethal somewhere could be very much an ICBM with a nuclear warhead at Israel. And He's going to prevent that. He's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of its might. Now, Elam is on the west coast of Iran. Ancient territory of Elam would be where the Bashar nuclear province is. The nuclear reactors are there. That is where Iran has portable missile launchers, underground missile silos. It's the closest part of Iran to attack Israel. And so it's an area that Israel would attack. But the point I'm making is that I can rifle off a whole bunch of prophecies where the Lord is angry. He's fiercely executing His vengeance. Remember, it's dealing with Genesis 12, verse 3, God's foreign policy, which is still intact. Where God said to Abraham, and it extrapolates on through his son, his grandson, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons, 12 tribes of Israel, onto the Jewish people today. That He would bless those that bless Israel, bless Abraham, but He would curse those who cursed them. So these are countries that are cursing Israel. Ultimately, they will be cursed in like manner. And if they're trying to curse Israel militarily, they will be cursed militarily. And so these prophecies, God is long-suffering presently, and I believe that's one of the reasons he's always long-suffering. Don't let me skip past that part. Merciful. But when he says it's time for these prophecies to happen, he will execute his vengeance and his fury. And I think when that happens, you won't have a long lapse between one prophecy to the next. They'll happen in a vacuum, one building upon the other, each one getting more powerful. And these are globally impacting prophecies. End times prophecies is globally impacting.
Let me ask you a question. If we take the Psalm 83, Isaiah 17:1, as you mentioned with Damascus, you have what we discussed before in our Ezekiel DVD series, the inner ring and the outer ring, and then you throw in the Jeremiah 49, the Elam. So those three happening prior to Ezekiel 38 at some point. How strong is Persia? At that point, are they? When the Ezekiel 38 happens, all these other more immediate enemies have been neutralized. Elam has already been wiped out because of that prophecy. Persia's there with Gog and Magog, the Russian component, and even Turkey. How strong are they?
Well, that's a good point. Right now, they're pretty strong. So let's look at where they are right now compared to where they would likely be after the Elam prophecy, the disaster in Elam. They're strong because they've got their proxies. Not only do they have their own ability with the perhaps nuclear breakout pretty soon with ICBMs and things like that. They got missiles that can hit Israel in 8 minutes, etc. But they've got Hezbollah with 150,000 missiles to the north of Israel that have some of those precision guided. They've got Bashar al-Assad, who, it's no secret, he's got chemical weapons. They got Hamas that wants to push Israel into the sea that always flares up and sends missiles into southern Israel. And they're going to be able to, they've actually shot missiles toward Tel Aviv in the last go-round. If it wasn't for the Iron Dome taking out a lot of those missiles, there'd been dead Israelis in Tel Aviv. So, and then there's Shiite militias in Iraq, etc. But if Elam gets hit, and it seems to be a nuclear disaster because it says after this disaster happens, it says the indigenous population, that the Elamites or the Iranians of the West Coast, they'll flee. They'll have to seek refuge. It says there'll be no nations where the exiles don't go. So, but to the point of your question, if that happens, and I believe Iran will respond, and they'll have Hezbollah start sending missiles, I think this war will escalate. Israel will do some attacking probably. We're not told who attacks Elam, but it says it's a confrontation by the sword. It'll happen until it's consumed by the sword. Elam will be consumed by the sword in the prophecy, which tends to be a military invasion. If this happens, I believe Iran will call upon its proxies, Hezbollah, Syria, etc. And I think at that point, the war will get so heavy with Israel, they actually have to destroy the city of Damascus, take it out as overnight, which is a prophecy in Isaiah 17. Israel wins the war ultimately. There's a disaster in Elam, and the proxies of Iran are no longer a problem because of the war. They're not. It's interesting when you look at the outer ring of countries in Ezekiel 38. Why are there no proxies of Iran listed there? There's no Lebanon where Hezbollah is. There's no Syria where Damascus is. There's no Gaza where the Hamas are. There's no Iraq where the Shia, that sort of thing. I think that's because they're taken out of the equation. Now, I am going to answer your question. I don't think all of Iran goes out of the equation because Persia is involved in Ezekiel 38 and verse 5. But if you notice, and I'm not going to make a big deal out of this, it just could be my own speculation. But when you look at Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6, and it talks about the invaders, Iran is not up at the top. It's Turkey and Russia. And then Iran gets an honorable mention down there with Ethiopia and Libya. Is that because Iran is compromised? Is Persia not as powerful as it is right now at that time? I think Iran's still around, and they certainly hook up with Russia because they're very upset with Israel and that sort of thing after what happens in Elam, after what happens in Damascus. But I'm not so sure they're a powerhouse like they are right now.
That's a good point, and something where we'll have to end on because, there's no doubt within all of biblical theology, the importance of first mention, and those that are put up front are the ones that are the leaders, and we've talked about that before. And so as we think about really what's going on, again, it is exciting in the sense of watching the Scripture unfold and all the scenarios happen. It's not exciting for really the sad atrocities of war. What would you say, kind of in closing, to the audience? I always like to think in terms of what would you say as encouragement to the believer or as a warning to the unbeliever that might be watching?
Okay, well, presently, I think it's very important to note that in these affected areas, especially Iran, it's the fastest growing evangelical population in the world. God is long-suffering, and he's busy supernaturally evangelizing through miracles, dreams, healings, and visions in Iran especially, because he knows what's going to happen. He's trying to get as many people saved as possible. This is a place, for instance, Iran, where a lot of missionaries don't want to go to, can't get into. And so therefore, God's taken his own heart into his hands and saving people supernaturally. So I think the point is that amidst all the geopolitical scenarios that we're talking about and the setups for wars, rumors of wars, and ultimately will turn into prophetic wars, we need to remember that God is really still busy doing what he does best, and that's saving people, bringing them into the kingdom of God. This is the time, really, people, because shortly after these things happen, we're going to get into the worst thing, where there'll be an antichrist and a tribulation after the rapture and these things, where it's not going to be a popular choice to become a Christian if you get left behind, and to make that decision, because one, you'll probably be martyred, you'll probably lose your life. 3 different periods of Christian martyrdom after the rapture. Plus, there'll be a lie going on. It's the lie of 2 Thessalonians. They'll have people convinced that no, Jesus is not the way, the truth, and the life. So right now is the time, it's the perfect time in the age of grace to put your faith in the Lord. Because what's coming down the pipe real quickly, prophetically speaking, that will happen probably in the very near future is this time's going to be very tough persecution for anybody that wants to get saved after the rapture.
Appreciate Bill. Appreciate you being here. We got some more work to do in the next couple of days. And, as we end today, we always appreciate your prayers. And as Bill mentioned, you think of Jesus's comments and as Bill also mentioned, God's heart. His heart is for those people that don't know him. And, God is coming to bring a time of 7 years of judgment. His patience with mankind's rebellion has come to an end, and he desires to make things right, and he is going to come judge the world. And it's right for him to do that. He doesn't apologize for judging sin. And so as we think about that, we also know Jesus' heart in Luke 21:36, where he right in the middle of the Olivet Discourse, he's talking about all these end time scenarios, and he says, pray that you would be counted worthy to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. And so when we think about that promise, for us it's exciting because we have the opportunity to be saved certainly by the Lord's death and his resurrection, and to stand before him and to escape these things that are coming on the earth, because ultimately God is going to start fresh and rule for 1,000 years on earth, as we've talked many times. Again, God's heart is to see mankind flourish and not to be in this era of immorality and confusion and everything else. So again, as always, thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.